السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. تضامن محبي العدالة والسلام في العالم مع الشعب السوري في وجه المعاناة والحصار ليس المبادرة الأولى في هذا الاتجاه، لكن الصرخة اليوم ناشدت الدول التي ترسل المسلحين والسلاح إلى سوريا التوقف عن الإسهام في زيادة معاناة الشعب السوري وسفك دماء الأبرياء. وفد دعاة السلام الدولي إلى سوريا من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. ليس من الصدفة بمكان أن يكون مؤلف كتاب الحجارة تصرخ هو الشخص نفسه الذي سمع صرخات واستغاثات وزفرات الحجارة الميتة وحتى الحية في سوريا. هو القس البريطاني أندرو اشداون الذي ترعرع في زيمبابوي في كنف عائلة من المبشرين أثناء الحرب الروديسية هناك، عاش قساوة حرب شعواء. الأب أندرو قام بعمل تطوعي في أماكن بعيدة ونائية لأنها بنظره تحمل الكثير من التجارب المليئة بالمعلومات. اشداون عميد مجمع في الأبرشية الأنغليكانية في وينشستر انكلترا، جال في آسيا وأفريقيا وأوروبا، وجوهر زياراته تمحور حول حوار الأديان ودراسات في الرهبنة. أما في العقدين الأخيرين فتطور لدى اشداون شغف وتعلق بمنطقة الشرق الأوسط وبشعوبها، ما دفعه إلى قيادة مجموعات وأفراد إلى المنطقة كزيارات عامة أو حتى خاصة لتكوين صورة واقعية على الأرض حول ما يجري من أحداث. وأرخ بعض هذه التجارب والزيارات في كتابه الحجارة تصرخ. في سياق متصل حل القس أندرو اشداون ضيفا على سوريا من ضمن وفد دعاة السلام الدولي إلى سوريا، وصرخ عاليا مطالبا برفع العقوبات عنها وبمساعدتها على تقرير مصيرها والتخلص من آثار وتداعيات الحرب التي فرضت عليها، ومناشدا الدول التي ترسل المسلحين والسلاح إلى سوريا التوقف عن الإسهام في زيادة معاناة الشعب السوري وسفك دماء الأبرياء. الأب أندرو تأثر عميقا بمعاناة الكثيرين من جراء الصراع في سوريا اليوم وبتفاني أولئك العازمين على تقديم العون والخدمات إلى من يحتاجها من أهل البلد، وقلق أيضا من تداعيات هذا الصراع على مستقبل سوريا كلها. Reverend Andrew Ashdown, Anglican priest in the Winchester Diocese in England. Welcome to the Inside, sir.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
You're most welcome, sir. Now, over the years, you have been traveling a lot back and forth across the Middle East, across the region, for the last 2 or 3 decades. And you've been part of a lot of journeys on interfaith dialogue and studies on this issue. Now you come to the region at a very crucial time, and you are part of a peace delegation or peace pilgrims. You come to Syria. Now, why are you keen on coming to Syria now, and what kind of pilgrimage is there in Syria?
What's going on in Syria is of crucial importance to the whole region, and perhaps the world in some senses as well. We've come at this time because we're a group of people from 10 different nationalities, over 30 people, some of them from very senior religious leaders as well, and community leaders. We've had a senior delegation from Iran joining the visit. And it's very much about meeting the people, listening to the people, learning what the situation is, and being able to share our concern from people around the world that although Syria may seem to be very isolated from the international community, there are many, many people all over the world who care deeply for what is going on in Syria, are very concerned at what is happening, and are also aware that the situation in Syria is to some degree certainly misrepresented in parts of the international media.
And the mainstream media.
Yes.
We will come back to this point and discuss
Certainly.
it further.
Sure.
But I want you here, please, Reverend, to tell me, now how important do you think such a visit by your delegation to Syria is for the people of Syria? And do you agree that the future of Syria would determine the future of the world?
It's very difficult as somebody from outside the country to go. We don't go in imagining that we can possibly change the situation overnight. And it is quite heartbreaking to meet people who have suffered unbelievably in the current situation. But it is vital that people who are able to communicate what is happening and who wish to communicate what is happening can meet the people, listen to the people, see the situation and share that back in our communities and with our governments, back in our own countries.
Because maybe there are certain people back at home in your country, they are in solidarity with the Syrian people, but they can't make it to Syria for certain reasons.
Absolutely, and I think there are very few people, very few international people who are traveling. There's a lot of fear. And
yes. But let me go back to the second part of my question, that do you agree that the future of Syria would determine the future of the world? How far is that true?
If Syria were to fall to extremist forces, Syria is in many ways a cradle of civilization. It's a cradle of faiths. It has in the past been a place of tolerance, where communities have lived together. I've visited many times Syria in the past, where Christians and Muslims have lived together in very good harmony most of the time. If extremism is allowed to succeed within Syria, which has been, as I say, a cradle of faith and a cradle of civilization, it of course raises hugely important dangers for all the neighboring countries.
Sure.
And for the relations internationally, for the whole region, and of course the worldwide community as well.
So you mean here that if you couldn't bring this extremism to a halt in Syria, it would just, blow the whole region?
I think it certainly has the potential for doing that, yes.
Now, let me go back to your peace delegation,
Yes.
sir. What was the itinerary of your visit, of this journey, and what were the goals for it?
Okay. The itinerary, we stayed for the first few days in Damascus. We met with senior religious leaders, and we went to, a few of us actually went to visit the community centers on the edge of Yarmouk refugee camp. So we met some of the displaced people of Yarmouk there, and that was a shocking experience. They're in terrible conditions there. And we then went up to Latakia, and we met people who have been displaced from their homes. We also met survivors of some of the massacres that have taken place in northern Syria. And we also went to Homs. And in Homs it was very inspiring because there is the Council for Reconciliation, Musalaha, in Homs, where the Syrian bishop and the local sheikh are working together to try and persuade the fighters to lay down their arms.
And those attempts were successful in certain...
They are being successful.
Yes.
They've documented about 1,000 fighters who have actually laid down their arms and have stopped fighting.
And they had amnesty from
And they had amnesty. And,
Yes.
and so there's a very important process. And this has been an interesting message that has come across from everybody we've spoken to, that reconciliation is actually key, it's absolutely key. Because when the war ends, and the war will end, there's going to be perhaps a long-term process of rebuilding not just the places, but the people.
Right.
Rehabilitating the people and reconciling the people to living together once again. And that process is starting, and that is truly inspiring to see.
Yes, because, waging war is very easy, but, attaining peace is something very difficult.
It's very difficult indeed. We also met with leaders of 8 opposition parties in Damascus last night, and that was extremely important as well, because the international media will often say that anybody who opposes the government will be killed, and actually we've witnessed that this is not the case, and people have been very free throughout our visit to say where they disagree with the government and some of its policies, and want to see change. But everyone that we've met is increasingly bitterly opposed to the tactics of the fighters.
Of the fighters. So this was the reality that you attempted to see on the ground.
Yes.
Actually, what were the goals of your visit? Also, in addition to seeing the reality on the ground, sir.
Yes. So apart from the obvious goals of listening to the people and seeing the situation that is happening on the ground, to talking to as many different people as possible with different opinions and different experiences, and to witness what is happening on the ground. A primary goal for all of us will be to go back to our countries and to speak with all our various networks, and many networks are represented on this group of people in many different countries. And we shall be speaking to representatives of our governments, to our international media, to our faith communities, and trying to share something of this message that people out there, I think, are not aware of what is really going on, and the situation for most people there, and how people are feeling.
So, sir, you talk to diversified segments of the Syrian society. You
Yes.
talk to politicians, you talk to dignitaries,
Yes.
religious authorities, common people,
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
refugee camps,
Yes,
and
opposition parties.
opposition parties,
Yes.
and all those different various
Yes.
segments of the Syrian society.
Yes.
What did you observe? As a person who belongs to your country, for example, what would you tell me about the people in Syria?
Firstly, I think we have all been deeply impressed by the resilience of the people in Syria. We've seen, yes, a diversity of opinion and a diversity of attitudes to what is happening. Not everybody supports the government, but there was an absolute unity amongst all the people we spoke to, even and amongst those who have suffered horrendously in the refugee camps, the displaced and so forth. That yes, change is needed in Syria, but they long for that society in which all communities can live together with mutual respect and in mutual harmony. All were very fearful of the extremism that is being practiced in parts of the country. Many actually were, whilst even those who said that they didn't agree with all the policies of the government, all were very supportive of Assad as a person. That came across very clearly. And in the West, Assad is demonized.
How do you see the fighting of hundreds and actually thousands of foreign fighters that
Yes.
come from various countries, from at least 83 countries across the globe? They come to fight in Syria, and some people come from your country,
Yes.
which is, they are taking part in all these atrocities against the Syrian people.
Yes.
How do you regard this?
As utterly criminal. It is something that the international community should not allow in any way whatsoever. It is appalling that some governments are wishing to fund those elements, and it should not be allowed. It should not be allowed. And the Syrian people and the Syrian governments have a right to respond to that.
Right. Now, sir, we're going to stop now for a short break,
Yes.
Reverend Andrew Eshdaun, and later after the break we'll be talking a bit more about the status of the Christians in the Orient,
Yes.
one of which, in
Yep.
Syria, and you've known a lot about this issue.
Yes, indeed.
Right, sir.
Thank you.
من الداخل سيعود بعد الفاصل، ابقوا معنا.
القس البريطاني أندرو اشداون كيف يرى مكانة المسيحيين في الشرق اليوم ولا سيما في سوريا، خاصة في ظل قتال تلك المجموعات المتطرفة التكفيرية الذي يقود إلى تدمير إحدى أقدم حضارات العالم ومهد المسيحية، ويدفع إلى نزوح وهجرة مختلف المجتمعات، وما تأثير ذلك في الإرث المسيحي الثقافي والديني.
I think this is one of the great tragedies of the Middle East, the whole of the region. Of course, the Middle East is the birthplace of Christianity. It's the cradle of Christianity. And the Christian communities throughout the Middle East have been part of the fabric of the culture and of the society. And the fact that we have Christianity, it comes from the Middle East. You know, we aren't the bearers of it in our own regions, but the origins are here. I've been sharing with the Christian communities of both Palestine and Jordan and Egypt and Lebanon and Syria as well for over 20 years. And that the numbers are diminishing in these lands is an utter tragedy for all the nations in which they live. I think it's also important to point out that the West would like to see this conflict as a battle between religions, and I don't believe it is. I mean, many Christians in the West are almost unaware that there are Christians in the Middle East, and so this is one of the other reasons why we've come, or why I've come, to try and heighten that awareness of the Christian communities, and to share that concern with others.
Now, what were the repercussions and the implications of the fighting in Syria on the status of the Christians in the Orient and on their cultural and religious heritage? I mean, you know, we've seen a lot of systematic methods of trying to drive the Christians out of Iraq, out of Syria now, maybe out of Lebanon, out of Palestine, occupied Palestine. There's no longer, you know, mentioning of the Christians in those areas.
The Middle East has been for many centuries a center for the diversity. And it is the diversity that makes up the richness of our cultures and of our people. The Christians are a crucial part of that diversity. And I don't believe, and I know there are Muslim imams whom I know in Britain and in this part of the world who do not believe that those fighters who would like to see Christianity wiped out of these lands represent Islam at all. That is not part of the heritage of the Christianity has been rooted in this land. And even from the earliest days of Islam, Christians and Muslims were learning from each other and working together and sharing common needs and aspirations for the people.
But you know, how did this war in Syria, for example, and you know, the occupation of Iraq, and then you know all the different various incidents that took place and are still taking place, those attacks by extremist groups, how did they, you know, make it haste for the Christians to leave?
I think all that is inevitably going to lead to the fleeing of the population, whether it be Christians or the other local. You know, we how many millions of people millions of Syrians are now refugees in neighbouring countries, and they, of course, vast numbers of Christians and vast numbers of Muslims, and probably the majority of Muslims as well. So it's inevitable that sort of activity and that sort of forcing of communities, whether they be Christian or Muslim, to adopt ways of life or ways of attitude to culture or faith that drive people away from their normal lifestyle, culture or heritage or faith, is going to lead to it's in effect expulsion almost.
Now let me go back to your visit to Syria, sir. You've been to Homs.
Yes.
What can you tell me about your visit there? What did you actually see?
We saw a city that has been devastated. We were surprised. I mean, there is much devastation around there. We were surprised that, again, it's a city which, of course, still has many people living within it, and life goes on in areas, despite the fact that there is regular shelling and regular attacks across the city. But there are parts of the city which you wouldn't know that there was that happening. It was shocking to meet those who have lost their loved ones in car bomb attacks, in missiles. We met with quite a few of the families and the children particularly. We saw children whose fathers have been kidnapped and murdered, and others who've simply been murdered in front of them.
So the devastation of the whole family.
The devastation of whole families. It affects absolutely everybody. But what was utterly inspiring was to see that we gathered together. We were there together as included in our parties, were religiously Christian leaders and both Shia and Sunni sheikhs together, seeking ways of understanding and reconciliation. And so that work within the city represents a real hope, I think. But it is a shocking environment.
But you know, such kind of news, sir, does not find its way into the mainstream Western media, most of the mainstream Western media. How do you explain their silence and their distortion of the realities on the ground in Syria?
I think it is much wider, more politically. At the end of the day, when talking about the Middle East, inevitably you start coming back to Israel. And I think that that whole situation there has enormous influence on the Western governments and their approach and their attitudes, and the media too. It's very difficult for us to speak on issues which Western governments or Western media do not wish to engage with. It's very hard to get through to those and to try and explore those issues with them.
Now, just allow me to go back to the issue that we talked about, that waging war is very easy, but trying to attain peace is rather difficult. Do you think that peace could be attainable in Syria anytime soon? And who is responsible for keeping the war going on and on, knowing the fact that it was recently revealed that according to Western diplomatic sources, quote, Washington is pressing the Israeli regime to attack Syrian troops in a bid to hinder their offensives against CIA-trained insurgents in the Golan Heights, unquote.
Probably to try and sustain the war, keep it going, and succeeding ousting and destroying the country.
Right. What's the last thing you can say to the Syrian people, to the resilient Syrian people?
It's the resilient Syrian people who I have such admiration for and love for, which is why I'm here. I have been to the country several times and travelled all over the country meeting members of all communities. They are a people of profound faith, courage, dignity, resilience, and they have been a community, exemplary community in terms of tolerance and acceptance of diversity.
Right.
And that diversity is something to be treasured. Treasure the diversity.
Sure.
One simple question may be to ask, what is life like under the kind of government in which a normal, civilized, I use the word democratic within inverted commas, compared to what is life like under the kind of elements that are being pushed by many in the outside world against Syria and the Syrian people.
Right.
And the Syrians can answer that question themselves, and they are starting to answer that question now. They're seeing what it means. And
Well, actually, just to underline the fact that it's a war against the people of Syria, allow me here to wrap up our edition for today to say that the health system, which was considered very good in Syria before the war erupted, has collapsed. A recent WHO report, World Health Organization report, said 60% of Syrian hospitals have either been damaged or completely destroyed during the conflict. Large numbers of doctors have fled the country, and the local production of medicines has declined by up to 70% since many pharmaceutical plants have been substantially damaged. Prior to the start of the conflict in March 2011, 90% of medicines in Syria were produced inside the country. Hunger is a real issue, and although the UN is feeding more than 3.8 million people in Syria, those most in need are not being reached because of the complicated dynamics of the battlefield. So it's a war not only against the government of Syria, but it's a war against the people of Syria, the innocent people of Syria. Reverend,
can I just say,
yes.
In 2010 I visited Syria with my family. I took my family on holiday to Syria, including my children, and we were able to visit a secondary girls' school and to arrange for my daughter to go and spend an afternoon with the girls in the secondary girls' school, and as a family we went. And we were profoundly impressed by the quality of the education. My daughter said, "This is amazing. We don't have this sort of quality of education in my own school in England." As you said, you know, the quality of life, the health system, the education system was very, very high. And the Syrian people will surely remember that and know that.
Now, Reverend Andrew Ashdown, Anglican priest in the Winchester Diocese in England, many thanks indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're most welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل، من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.